What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
At my promotion dinner, where the plan was to smile through a few speeches and let the moment be simple for once, Dad leaned back with that easy laugh he saves for other people and said, "Your sister's the one with a real career, not you." And I kept my hands steady on the water glass because I have learned the hard way that steady hands can be louder than a raised voice, and before I could decide whether to ignore him or call it out right there, my manager, Evelyn, leaned forward like she was dropping a napkin into the quiet and said, "Funny, she just sent me her resume," and my sister's fork slipped onto the plate with a sound that made the whole table pretend to cough. I wish I could tell you I was surprised, but I have lived through a lifetime of little reruns where my wins became everyone else's errands, and my milestones got handed to my sister like a flyer for an event she had no intention of attending. So, what hit me first was not shock. It was that familiar mix of heat and clarity that says do not swing, do not cry, just choose your move and stick to it, because if I have learned anything it is that you cannot act out a story that was written for you by someone who prefers you small. You have to replace it with a story they never thought you would tell. Mom did the thing she always does, the smoothing voice and the quick change of subject, asking about dessert as if sugar could dissolve disrespect, and Dad chuckled into his water like he had been handed a punchline the rest of us were too sensitive to enjoy, while my sister, Hannah, kept her eyes on the table and said she was just exploring options, the same way she has always framed it when she noses around my lane and then acts surprised that she is standing in traffic, and Evelyn sipped her drink and looked at me with a kind of private question, the kind you only get when someone at work has seen you fight for every inch without using a single cheap trick. There is history here, and it matters, and I will say it plainly because dressing it up only protects the people who benefit from the fog. Dad believes in outcomes when they belong to my sister and effort when it belongs to me. And for years I tried to earn my way out of that trap by over-delivering on everything, thinking that if I just stacked enough undeniable facts in one place he would have to see me, only to realize that people who need you to be lesser for their favorite child to feel bigger will always move the goalposts, so I stopped chasing approval and built my own scoreboard at work, the kind that leads to a promotion you can hold in your hand like a key, which is why this dinner existed in the first place. I took a breath, long and careful, and said I was happy for anyone who wanted to apply to our company to do so through the front door, because it keeps things fair and it keeps me clean. And I thanked Dad for coming to celebrate even if he did not fully understand what he was celebrating, which made him huff about jokes and how I had lost my sense of humor, and then I turned to Evelyn and asked, right there at the table where every word could be weighed later, whether our team was still running. That skills case for external candidates, the one that anonymizes submissions and forces everyone, no matter their last name, to show what they can actually do, and Evelyn nodded with that small smile that means she is with me, but she will not rescue me. Because she knows I do not want to be rescued, I want to be respected. Hannah put on the wide-eyed innocence that used to work on teachers and relatives who only showed up for holidays, saying she did not know the job was in my department and she did not mean anything by it, and that it would be amazing to work together since we are family and families help each other, and for a second I felt that old tug, the part of me that still wants to be the bigger person even when the room is built to make me small. But then I remembered every late night I kept my own name out of someone else's mouth by doing the work they refused to do, so I smiled and said that if she chose to move forward she would be treated exactly like every other candidate, which is the only kind of help I offer anymore. Dad called that cold, which is funny considering how warm he gets when telling everyone my sister is the real success, and I could feel the table split into camps. The ones who thought I should shrug and the few who were finally seeing the pattern line up in a way that could not be explained away by mood or timing, so I reached for my phone, not to hide, but to act. And I texted Evelyn a simple line that said we should schedule the first screen for early next week and attach the take-home case. That requires a portfolio of measurable outcomes, and that I would formally recuse myself from the panel to avoid even the whisper of favoritism. And Evelyn's reply buzzed back with a yes, and a tiny addendum that we could turn around the results quickly if the submissions came in on time. When dessert finally did land, Dad tried to toast my sister for being brave enough to try something new, which would have been almost sweet if it was not such a neat way to shove me off the stage at my own event. So I lifted my glass and said I wanted to toast everyone who tries something the hard way, the honest way, the way where you cannot hide behind anyone's last name, and the poor waiter froze because he could feel the air thicken. And I almost apologized to him out of habit before I remembered that I am not responsible for the weight of a room when I did not pack the boxes. Hannah leaned in with a soft smile and said she hoped there would be no awkwardness at work because she valued our relationship and wanted to keep things light, and I said I valued boundaries and results and that lightness comes from both, not from pretending gravity does not exist, and I told her, kindly and evenly, that I would not be a reference, I would not be a shortcut, and I would not be an apology for earning the seat I earned. And for the first time that evening she looked at me like I was not the familiar piece she could rearrange, but a locked door with a sign that says use the entrance like everyone else. On the way out, while Dad argued with the host about something pointless and Mom dabbed at a spot on the tablecloth, as if polishing the evening could fix it, I stood with Evelyn in the hallway and asked whether there was anything else I should know. And she said there was a cover letter, and that I should probably read it before the interview because it contains something I might care about, and I felt that same heat and clarity again, only steadier now, and I told her to send it and to include one more line in the case instructions, the one that says candidates must cite the sources of any metrics they claim, because if my sister wants a real career, she can prove real outcomes on paper, and then I walked back to the table, signed the check with my own name, and left Dad's joke untouched on the plate where it belonged, as the first move settled into place and the next one asked to be made. The email from Evelyn landed before midnight with the resume and cover letter attached, and while I stared at the subject line long enough to remind myself that curiosity is not the same thing as panic, I opened it and read my sister's words roll out with this breezy confidence that has always impressed other people and exhausted me, because there it was in black and white, a neat paragraph claiming that she led stakeholder alignment on a cross-functional analytics rollout that reduced reporting time by more than half, and that she built trust with skeptical partners by designing a plain language scorecard, which would have been very impressive if the rollout were not mine, the hard conversations were not mine, and the scorecard were not the document I drafted on a Sunday night while my phone buzzed with family photos I was expected to comment on with heart eyes, and I felt the sting you feel when someone takes your work and wraps it in a tone that says this was always easy for them, yet right beneath the sting there was a steadier feeling that said this is the line where you stop explaining and start acting. So I replied to Evelyn with a short acknowledgement and then wrote a second message, not to my sister and not to my parents, but to talent acquisition, where I documented my recusal from the panel, the family relationship, and the need to run this process by the book, adding that in addition to anonymizing the take-home case, we should require candidates to cite the sources of any metrics, to record a brief narration explaining the logic of their choices, and to include a changelog with timestamps if they revise their submission after the first upload, because I have learned that integrity is not a vibe, it is evidence. And I copied our compliance partner so that no one could later claim I hid the ball or shaped the field to trip one person in particular. After that, because I know the difference between petty and precise, I opened our internal wiki and exported the version history of the scorecard I wrote, which shows dates, authors, and comments. And I saved a clean PDF with my authorship baked into the margins, not to swing like a hammer, but to lay the floor straight, and then I checked Hannah's public profile and saw she had recently added a line about consulting on analytics adoption, which is the kind of soft phrasing that gives plausible deniability while nudging anyone skimming her page to imagine far more than what happened, and I closed the tab without sending a single message, because I am done lecturing people who already know what they are doing. At home the next evening, Mom asked whether there was any way to soften the process so Hannah would not feel targeted, and I said the only way to make a fair test softer is to make it unfair. And that if Hannah wanted to be treated like everyone else, then she would get the exact experience everyone else gets, which is the only kindness that matters in a room like this. And when Dad called a few minutes later to say I should send Hannah a few pointers, since I know the culture and could save her some time. I told him that saving people time is not my job unless they are on my team, and even then the help comes after they show their own effort, at which point he tried the old script about family loyalty. And I said loyalty that demands dishonesty is just pressure with better branding. Evelyn and I met early the following morning to finalize the case, and we chose a scenario that mirrored the real problems our clients bring us without copying any proprietary detail. Then we drafted questions that could be answered in many reasonable ways, but would immediately expose a candidate who confused buzzwords with judgment. And we added one deceptively simple prompt that asked for a time when the candidate gave credit and how they made sure the right person was recognized, because you learn more from how people talk about other people's work than from how they describe their own. And when we were done, I posted the open role to a broader network than usual, not to stack the deck, but to raise the tide, since high water makes it very obvious who can swim. Hannah texted a carefully friendly message saying she hoped there were no hard feelings, and I replied that there were firm boundaries and a clear process, and that both were good news, because they keep relationships intact even when people are ambitious in messy ways. And she sent a thumbs up, which I chose to interpret as acknowledgement rather than provocation, and then I put my phone face down and spent the afternoon preparing my team for the incoming work, because regardless of how this played out, my job still required results that did not care about my dining table drama. 2 days later, the first batch of anonymized take-home files arrived in the review folder with candidate codes in place of names, and I watched my colleagues skim, annotate, and score without any idea that one of the submissions belonged to a person who has known me since I was learning to tie my shoes. And I felt a strange blend of dread and relief as I opened the file marked with a random string that meant nothing to me until the first sentence flowed past my eyes and landed like a fingerprint, because it was not only the structure and the tone that felt familiar, it was a sentence I wrote last year, down to the way I explained the trade-off between frequency and trust, which meant I was staring at my own words wearing someone else's name. And while a dozen responses crowded to the front of my throat, I did the only thing I promised myself I would do, which was nothing public at all. So I pinged Evelyn with the file code, attached the wiki export with its dates and comments, and asked her to keep the panel blind, to follow the rubric, and to let the candidate choose how deep a hole to keep digging, as my cursor hovered over a second document that looked suspiciously derivative and waited for the upload indicator to finish moving. When the interview cycle officially began, I knew I had already done my part by setting the boundaries in writing and ensuring the process was airtight, but even with all the structures in place, the truth is that when family steps into your professional world, every clean line you draw still feels messy, because history does not erase itself just because you documented a policy. So I sat quietly in my office the morning of the interviews, watching the calendar reminders roll in one after another, while my team met with each candidate under the same anonymous code system, and I let the minutes pass until the familiar rhythm of Slack pings and hallway chatter told me that one particular candidate had left a very different kind of impression. The kind you do not even have to ask about because the faces of the people in the room tell the story before the notes are uploaded. The feedback came in with the usual balance of numbers and short write-ups, and I kept my eyes steady as I read through them, line after line of observations that cut through the shiny phrases and revealed the substance underneath, or, in this case, the lack of it. Phrases like relied on jargon without depth and claimed responsibility for group outcomes without clear examples filled the comment fields, and the lowest score came from the question I had quietly insisted on, the one about how they ensured credit went to the right person, where the response had been a vague platitude about teamwork that carried no weight, because anyone who has really done the work knows you can describe exactly how you lifted someone else's name when it counted. And the absence of detail was its own kind of confession. I knew without needing to check the code which candidate had stumbled in that way, but to be absolutely certain, I cross-referenced the uploaded narration file. And the moment I heard the voice reading aloud my own phrasing from a project summary I had authored 2 fiscal years earlier, I closed my laptop for a full minute. Not out of rage, but because I wanted to give myself the gift of silence before I decided what to do next, and in that pause, I realized the trap had already sprung, not because I designed it to be cruel, but because I had built it to be fair, and fairness is a kind of light that does not hide the cracks, it exposes them, whether the person standing in it is your sister or a stranger. At home, however, the narrative spun differently, because Dad called me that evening, full of the same impatient certainty he has carried into every conversation since I was old enough to understand tone, telling me that Hannah felt the interview had been strangely aggressive and that perhaps my company was not the right fit for someone with real creative flair, and I let him talk without interrupting until he circled back to the old accusation that I was threatened by Hannah's talent, which made me almost laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable, like hearing an old song on the radio that you once knew by heart and now recognize only as noise. I told him calmly that the process had been blind, that I had recused myself, and that if Hannah struggled it was because she had walked into a room built to test substance rather than spin. And the silence on the other end of the line told me he either did not believe me or did not want to. But before he could regroup and fire another round of rehearsed lines, I said one more thing, which was that loyalty to family is not measured by how many corners you are willing to cut for them, but by how much truth you are willing to hold up in front of them when it matters. And then I excused myself from the call because I have stopped giving endless airtime to arguments that were decided decades ago in his mind. The following day, Hannah appeared in my office unannounced, all polished smiles and forced warmth, saying she just wanted to clear the air and that she hoped the team did not misunderstand her answers. And I kept my tone professional while I reminded her that the process was confidential and I could not discuss specifics, though I did add that transparency and evidence are what move people forward here, not family ties, and she blinked, nodded, and shifted in her seat, the way people do when they know the mirror is reflecting something they cannot easily deny. Evelyn stopped by later with the full panel debrief, and when she sat across from me, her first words were that the outcome was clear. There was no path forward for that candidate, and, while she did not say Hannah's name, the look in her eyes confirmed she knew exactly who we were talking about, and she also knew I had managed the boundary perfectly, never once trying to tilt the scales. Never once stepping outside the role of someone who understands that revenge is most powerful when it looks exactly like justice. That night, as I sat at my desk sorting through the week's reports, I thought about how many years I had let myself shrink to keep the peace. How many times I had swallowed the words that burned the back of my throat so that dinners could stay civil and holidays could feel less like trials, and I decided then that this was no longer about whether Hannah got the job or not. It was about showing myself that I could stand still while someone else stumbled under the weight of their own choices, and that I did not have to dirty my hands to make the point land. But the moment that sealed the realization came the next morning, when Mom, in her well-meaning way, called to say Hannah was embarrassed and hurt and that perhaps I could smooth things over by inviting her to shadow me at work for a day. And I let the suggestion hang there long enough for Mom to hear the silence, then told her that smoothing things over was just another way of asking me to erase the truth, and I would not be doing that anymore. Not for Dad. Not for Hannah, not for her. Because every time I have erased myself to make them comfortable, I have paid the price alone, and the only comfort I am interested in now is the kind that comes from never erasing again. As I ended the call and leaned back, I realized the trap had not only revealed Hannah's limits, it had revealed mine too, the limit of how much I was willing to bend, how far I was willing to contort myself to stay in the family's good graces. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the spine of my own boundaries lock into place, knowing the next move would not just be about proving her wrong, it would be about finally proving myself right. When the official rejection email went out, it was phrased in the same careful, professional language that every candidate receives, a bland but respectful line about not moving forward at this time and wishing the applicant well in future pursuits. Yet the fallout at home carried none of that neutrality, because within hours my phone lit up with Dad's number, and instead of hello, what came through the speaker was an accusation, sharp and tired at the same time, that I had sabotaged Hannah's chances, that I had somehow whispered in rooms I was not even sitting in, and that the whole process was designed to humiliate her rather than give her a fair shot. And I let him finish without interrupting because I already knew that in his mind my guilt was not a matter of fact, it was a matter of family script. The same script that had been rehearsed and recycled through birthdays, graduations, and every milestone where I was supposed to stay small enough for Hannah to shine. I told him again, slowly and clearly, that I had recused myself from the panel, that every decision had been documented, that the process was blind and scored by people who had never seen Hannah's face or heard her last name, and that the outcome was simply what happens when charm meets a wall built from substance. But instead of listening, he shifted into that wounded laugh he uses whenever reality does not align with his version of events, muttering about how I was always too rigid, too rules-driven, too unwilling to bend for the sake of keeping things in the family. And as he spoke, I realized that for him, fairness has never been about balance or merit. It has always been about cushioning the person he chose to protect while sharpening the edges against the one he decided could take the cuts. When I hung up, not in anger, but in refusal to keep circling the same dead track, Mom followed with her softer tone, saying maybe I could extend an olive branch, maybe invite Hannah to one of our team happy hours just so she could feel included. And I almost laughed out loud at the absurdity of it, because I've spent my entire adult life working to be included in rooms where no one cared about my last name, only my work, and now I was supposed to hand over that hard-won space as a kind of consolation prize for someone who believed she could cut the line. And I told Mom that the olive tree had been burned down years ago, that the only branches left standing were the ones I grew myself, and that no one else gets to carve their initials into them. Evelyn, seeing the storm clouds gathering around me, pulled me aside one afternoon and said something I will never forget. The way you stayed calm through all this made you stronger in their eyes, not weaker, and that strength is worth more than any single outcome. And for a moment I let that truth settle, because she was right. My team had seen me hold the line without breaking, and while my family framed it as cruelty, the people who mattered to my career framed it as leadership, and that contrast told me everything I needed to know about which world I wanted to keep building in. But even with that clarity, the house itself became unbearable, because Dad doubled down at dinner one weekend, launching into a speech about how Hannah had courage for trying something new and how I had a responsibility as the older sister to clear the path. And I finally dropped the quiet compliance I had been practicing for decades and told him, in front of everyone, that courage without preparation is just entitlement in better clothes, that I had spent years earning what he kept dismissing as luck, and that I was done carrying the silence that allowed him to keep rewriting me as the side character in my own story. And the look on his face was not shock, it was irritation. As if I had broken some unspoken deal where he got to insult me and I was supposed to thank him for noticing I existed. The table went silent except for Hannah's exaggerated sigh and Mom's attempt to redirect the conversation back to neutral ground. But I stayed in my seat and I stayed in my truth, and when I left that night I felt lighter, not because I had convinced anyone, but because I no longer needed to. The air at home would never clear until someone stopped spraying the perfume of excuses over the rot, and I had finally stopped holding the bottle. Still, even strength needs a plan, and as I walked back into work the next Monday, I understood that what I wanted now was not just the private victory of having held the line, but the public demonstration that I could turn everything they mocked me for into undeniable proof, the kind that could not be spun, denied, or twisted, and that meant setting up one more move. One that would silence the cheap shots and lock my family into the reality they kept dodging. So when Evelyn congratulated me again on the promotion and hinted at a major deal we were close to closing, I asked whether we could time the announcement to line up with a particular evening, because sometimes the most satisfying justice is not a speech, not a fight, but a perfectly timed fact that lands so cleanly it cannot be argued away. And as she agreed with a knowing smile, I felt the anticipation of that moment build like pressure behind a dam, ready to break at exactly the right time. When the evening of the second dinner finally arrived, this time in my space and on my terms, I knew that every detail had been chosen not out of pettiness, but out of precision, because if there is one thing I have learned, It is that timing and setting can say as much as words ever could. So I reserved a long table at the restaurant my father always calls too modern, yet never declines when someone else is paying. And I made sure the guest list was arranged in a way that left no room for escape routes, with my parents sitting across from me, Hannah seated squarely in the middle, and a few of my colleagues, including Evelyn, invited under the guise of celebrating my recent promotion. Though the truth was that their presence was not only deserved but essential, because nothing cuts through the fog of family denial quite like witnesses who live outside of it. The evening began with the usual pleasantries, forced smiles, and clumsy compliments that everyone knows are brittle enough to snap under the weight of a single real sentence, and I let them play their roles. Nodding politely while Dad made a few barbed jokes about how long I had kept the table waiting, comments that in the past would have left me shrinking into silence, but tonight rolled off me like water because I had already rehearsed the move that would end this cycle. Not by shouting or pleading, but by letting the truth announce itself. Evelyn, who had agreed to stop by just for a toast before leaving for another engagement, arrived on cue with a small envelope in her hand, and after the server cleared the appetizers, she stood, raised her glass, and congratulated me in front of everyone on the successful close of the largest client deal our team had signed in the last 3 years, a contract so significant that it had been the final trigger for my promotion, and as she spoke, I watched the expressions shift around the table. The polite indifference of my parents faltering, Hannah's fixed smile twitching at the corners, and even Mom's practiced nod losing its rhythm as Evelyn laid out numbers that could not be waved away with jokes about real careers. When Evelyn excused herself with a smile and a firm handshake, leaving the envelope behind for me, I opened it slowly and pulled out the printed announcement, complete with signatures and formal seals. Proof that what had happened was not luck or favoritism, but the kind of achievement that companies write case studies about, and I passed the document around the table without saying a word, because silence in the right moment can feel louder than any monologue. And by the time it circled back to me, no one dared suggest that my success was a fluke. But I was not finished, because once the plates for the main course were set down, I turned to my father and reminded him, calmly and evenly, that at the last dinner he had joked about my sister being the one with the real career, and that the irony of his timing could not be ignored, given that only a week after dismissing me at my own celebration, Hannah had submitted her resume to my company, hoping to land a role on my team. And I let the words hang just long enough for him to process, before adding that while the application had been handled fairly and without interference, the results had been clear, and the silence around the table broke not because anyone responded, but because Hannah's fork clattered against her plate once again. The same sound as that first night, a sound that seemed to mark the collapse of a story she had been allowed to tell for far too long. Dad shifted in his chair, ready to mount some defense, but I cut him off not with anger but with a fact, saying that my career had never needed his approval to be real, and that what hurt was not his jokes, but the years of minimizing everything I built while applauding even the faintest attempt Hannah made to step into the same world, and I finished by telling him that from now on, I would no longer carry the burden of proving myself at family dinners, because the results were in writing and the respect I needed had already been given by the people who actually understood the work. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not suffocating for me the way it used to be, because this time it was not me trapped under their judgment, it was them trapped under the truth, and when Hannah stood abruptly, muttered something about needing air, and left the table without looking back, Dad sat there frozen, unable to recycle the old lines about loyalty or humor, and Mom's attempt to bridge the gap with small talk fizzled out into nothing, leaving me with the rare, satisfying clarity that I had not shouted, not insulted, not schemed, but simply allowed reality to shine in a way they could not twist. I signed the check myself, not because I had to but because it felt right to close the evening on my own terms, and as I stood to leave, I looked at my father one last time and told him plainly that sometimes the most powerful statement a daughter can make is not a plea for recognition, but a refusal to shrink any longer, and that whether he ever admitted it or not, I had built a career strong enough to withstand his disbelief, and now strong enough to expose the cracks in the pedestal he had Built for Hannah. Walking out into the night, I did not feel triumphant in a childish way, nor vindictive in the shallow sense, but rather steady. Like someone who had finally learned that the best revenge is not revenge at all, but the unshakable knowledge that you can let the truth speak for you, and that once it does, no denial, no excuse, and no joke can drown it out, leaving only the echo of a moment that, for the first time in years, belonged entirely to me.